Hello, my name is Ed, otherwise known as Demonic Tutors. I stream a lot on Twitch, and I have been putting this video off for a long time, but this is the Yawgmoth 102 video. We're going to go deeper into some strategies for Yawgmoth and some tips, and we're going to try and progress down and make it a little bit more complicated than the last video I did, which was 101, which is very basic, very introductory. Now we're going to talk more about advanced strategy, how I play the deck, and things and little tips that I've picked up over my time playing the deck. The first thing we're going to talk about basic strategy, and the basic strategy that I use for Yawgmoth is every turn you want to develop your board as much as possible. That sounds kind of simple, but in reality, it can be kind of confusing and kind of sometimes you get lost. So we're going to start off with a very basic game. Some of the important things in Yawgmoth, I've always felt, is keeping your life total nice and high as well. So here we are. We're going to start off. We're just going to play a little game for fun, and I'm going to talk about the developing your board strategy. And you always want to think like 1 or 2 turns in advance. So obviously, you basically always just want to ramp when you can. You want to put as much stuff on the board as possible, and you want to think about, well, the turn after and the turn after that, what's it going to look like, right? So right now we're set up for turn 1 bird, turn 2 we can chord for a Dryad Arbor, we could do whatever, but always want to preserve your life total, keep it nice and high, always keep your life total as high as possible, so that gives you an easier chance of killing with Giraffe Messenger down the line. So we just play the Bird's Paradise. Usually this bird would get killed. The format has designed itself to kill Ragavans, and in killing Ragavans, our poor innocent little birds here die quite a bit. But for the sake of what we're doing here, we're just going to say it lives. Right? So the list that I'm playing is very basic. It's 4 birds, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4 evolutions, 4 chords, 4 grist, 4 Yawgmoth, and then 4 flexible, not really flexible, but just 4 sort of value toolboxy cards. Blood Artist is the good finisher. And so you always, and we're also playing an Endurance. So you always want to remember what flex cards in your deck, and you always want to plan for them and sort of always build your game plan around what you have access to. Like, for example, here, we want to look at this turn. Like, we have a lot of options this turn. The best option is, since we have a Chord of Calling, the best option is probably to just play the Yawgmoth, and then at the end of our opponent's turn, we kind of are wasting this mana. It's not really that great to Eldritch Evolution a Birds of Paradise away, but I do think that we want to chord here, because we want to think about the next turn, right? And we want to think about what is happening on the next turn. So like next turn we can go in with 1, 2, 3, 4 mana, or we can go into it with a chord here. We have a lot of tutor stuff here. We have a lot of tutors in this particular hand, but I think we want to think about what happens next turn. So kind of leaving these 3 cards here, we might as well use them, right? Just to have 5 mana the next turn as opposed to 3. So we'll just go green, 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 chord for the Dryad Arbor. I hate drawing the Dryad Arbor, but I love that the Dryad Arbor is a tool we can get. So now here we are. We have 4 mana. Now we're going to go into turn number 3, and now we drew a Yawgmoth, right? So here we go. What are our options? We can play a Yawgmoth, which is probably going to be what we're going to end up doing. We have access to 5 mana and 6 permanents for the chord. So I think the best thing to do is to play the land. And this represents a dual land here, and these creatures don't. So I tend to want to leave the dual land open, or You always want to leave the land that gives you the most options. Let's say it's a sideboard game. This is essentially a bayou here. And like, we want to use our creature mana as much as possible because that way, we can now proceed to like sack these things and sack this, right? And we could start messing around if we need to. We don't necessarily need to, but you want to think about all your options this turn. We basically have 1 mana unspent, right? And we want to use this mana. Like every turn, you want to use your mana, progress your board, expand to the point where you could just use all your mana and kill them. Yawgmoth is a very greedy deck, and you don't generally want to leave 1 mana like this. So what can we do about this 1 mana? Well, we could start using the Yawgmoth. We can sack, let's pretend our opponent has a creature. We can sack the Yawgmoth, target the opponent's creature, which we're not going to do because they don't have a creature. And we'll choose nothing. We'll sack the Yawgmoth, right? Always yield to the Yawgmoth, always yield to Yawg. So now look, we drew a Birds of Paradise. It's not usually that easy, but this represents what I like to think. I don't want to go too hard on the Yawgmoth, right? Like sack too many of these things because we're sacking lands to draw cards, which we don't necessarily want to do, but we do want to have access to this. That's why I like using the creature mana first in general, unless we need blockers. But you like to be able to, let's say someone does kill Yawgmoth next turn, we want to be able to use these creatures to draw cards. So we did that. That was pretty easy to develop our board. So now, at this point, we can't really win the game, but we've come a long way on turn 3. Obviously, this is Magical Christmas Land, where our opponents can't interact with us, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 mana going into the next turn. If we were to be able to go untapped into the next turn with these cards, there's no way we're not killing our opponent, basically. So let's skip. Let's go to the next turn, right? So the easiest way to kill someone with Yawgmoth is just getting a Giraffe's Messenger. So if we have more life than our opponent, let's say our opponent's at 17 life, right? We could just Eldritch Evolution any of these creatures away, get a Giraffe's Messenger, and just they're dead. We just bounce the Giraffe Messenger, bounce the Yawgmoth. They are DEAD dead. Very simple. Now, there's some caveats to that, right? Like, let's say you're playing against Burn, and you go all the way down, you basically pay 2 to do 2 to them, and then you go all the way down to 1 life, and then you kill them, and then they're just like, well, I'm going to bolt you. And you're just like, crap. So there's lots of ways, and you always want to think about what your opponent has and what your opponent can do to interact with you, and you want to think about what's the best sort of solution, right? And you always want to try and build in layers of protection. So, for example, you can go 1, 2, 3 here, and we can take the Birds of Paradise, and we can sack the Birds of Paradise, target the Yawgmoth. Then we can Eldritch Evolution the Yawgmoth away. Oh, we'll do that. We'll float the mana, right? Because if we want to kill our birds, we might as well float the mana first. And then we sack into our Yawgmoth. Then we pay 1. Then now that we have the Yawgmoth undying, we can go green, cast the Eldritch Evolution, sacrifice this. Now we can get the Giraffe's Messenger. But we can also protect ourselves a little bit by courting for the Blood Artist to offer some level of protection so we don't just die to a lightning bolt. Or if they have more life than us, right? Then we can cord green, green, green. 1, 2, 3, bop, 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 bop. And we could cord for the Blood Artist. Right? And then we can just kill them. They die to Giraffe's Messenger having more life if they have more life than us, and we also have the Blood Artist drain. Right? There are a lot of ways to build in protections while you're comboing. This is obviously Magical Christmas Land with our opponent not really interacting with us. So let's try that again. That was like a very clean sort of example. They died on turn 4. Usually we don't really get to develop our board like that, but I won. Alright, so... oh, that's it. We will go back and we will create another one. So we'll just go through... and one of the things about this deck... so this hand is kind of sketchy. In fact, it's not really keepable. This bird has to live, and birds generally die. So we wouldn't want to keep this hand. We'd want to send this hand back. This hand's a little bit better. This hand's very good in terms of it just is turbo to Yawgmoth. Now, deciding what you want to put back is oftentimes difficult, right? Because you want this, you want this, you want a creature. It's always hard to send back a land for me. Because, like, if this creature dies, you know, we play this creature, it dies, then we play this, you know, and then we put back a land and we're just toast. But I think in this situation I am going to put back a land. Just because this is such a nice little curve. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, basically. So we'll put back the Urborg. We'll hit done. We drew a Yawgmoth. So now we will want to start off. Like right here, I would start off with a forest. Because I like keeping my life total high. I always like keeping my life total high. Even if it does end up costing me some games. So now here, with this, if we would untap with this, I would probably crack this for a swamp. And then I would go 1, 2, play the Wall of Roots. -1 on the Wall of Roots, -2. Play the Stranglegeist. This is my favorite opener in the deck. Just, you know, basic, 18 life. We are attacking for 3 here. We've got a lot going on. This is my favorite start in the whole game. But it usually doesn't happen this way. Obviously, our opponent's going to mess with us. But now we're going to go to the next turn. We get to attack. Yay. Okay. Get the Exalted trigger. It's beautiful. So now we can start messing with Yawgmoth. So always want to use your Wall of Roots. Bink, 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 bink. Yawgmoth. So now this situation, we want to think about what we can do. We have a land drop, and we have a Yawgmoth. Now, we don't have a cord. We don't really have anything yet. But we do have the Yawgmoth and the land. So this is a really good spot for us. So first thing we want to do is we want to sack this. Maybe we find a land that comes into play untapped that we don't have to lose life for. We're sacking this anyway to draw cards, so we might as well do that before we play this land. So we get as much information. Like let's say we draw the 3, let's say that we draw the Blooming Marsh. Because we know we're sacking this creature, so we might as well sack this creature before we play this land. Before you slam your lands, you want to make sure you're doing the right one. Like let's say we draw, and we draw, like we said, we draw the Blooming Marsh. We would have wanted to play that instead of playing this. So before we get to work, you know, obviously there are some exceptions. If you're expecting removal from Yawg, you might as well just play the Yawgmoth before you start doing stuff. But we play the Yawg, we start doing stuff right away. We'll sack this. Choose nothing, sack this. Usually we'd want to kill one of our creatures. One of our opponent's creatures. Okay, so now we drew this land. We can use this instead of this to only lose 1 life. To get the forest. Now we play the Yawgmoth. Now, see now, right? In order to win the game with these 2 undying creatures, we need a Blood Artist. So we cannot progress our board anymore this turn unless there's 2 ways that we can win the game from this spot. Number 1 is we hit an Endurance. This is using my list. Other people's lists are going to be a little bit different. But my list, we have Endurance and we have Court of Calling, right? So the one thing we can do, right, is we can bounce these two back and forth until we hit a Court of Calling, and then we can pass the turn to our opponent's upkeep, and then we can go -1 from the Wall of Roots, tap it, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that would be a chord for Blood Artist. But we'd have to do it during our opponent's upkeep. Unless we were to hit the Endurance. Right? If we hit the Endurance, we can put the Endurance in play and then use the Endurance to chord for the Blood Artist. So we could go tap Endurance, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's a chord for 2. Does that make sense? Which gets us the Blood Artist. So, right now, we can't actually kill them unless we draw a Court of Calling before we draw the Blood Artist. We win the game this turn if we draw Endurance plus Court of Calling before we draw Blood Artist. But that's how you win from this spot. Like, the game's not over even though you have this combo. And you also have to be aware of the fact that, like, let's say you commit to bouncing these two back and forth to draw a bunch of cards, and we're already at 12 life, right? So we could very easily just die to bolt, die to 2 bolts, die to something like that. So you always have to be conscious of if you should, how deep you should go. But generally, you always want to think what's pretty safe. You want to take a safe and reasonable line. This was that land I was talking about. Maybe we drew instead of this, the Blooming Marsh. Because you want to get it into play now as opposed to later. So now we're going to just do this for a little bit. Like, obviously, how deep you go depends on the matchup, right? Like, against certain decks, like, let's say we're playing against Living End, for example. If we were playing against Living End, I would keep drawing all the way down to 1 life, and then I would go to my end step and I would discard a bunch of creatures. That way, if my opponent casts a Living End, all these creatures would come back into play. But if I'm playing against Burn, for example, I would stop right here, knowing that next turn, as long as I untap, I can use this Eldritch Evolution to get a Blood Artist and kill them, right? So from this point, it depends on what you're playing against. 8 life is kind of sketchy to keep going. You know, you could keep going, but you're at 8 life, so there's a potential fail rate. So, with my list, not playing the Essence Warden. Now, there are some lists that would play Essence Warden from this spot, right? And then you could chord for an Essence Warden, but then you'd have to play Essence Warden. I personally don't think Essence Warden is good enough to play. I personally feel, that's my personal take, I don't think it's worth playing a 1/1 for 1 with no text in a lot of situations in the format of Modern, when Wrenn and 6 is one of the most popular cards. I don't think that that's where I want to be. But it is. There are versions of Yawgmoth that play it. Reed Duke plays Essence Warden, and he's a very good player, and he's, you know, big into Yawgmoth as well. But if you did have Essence Warden in this spot, you could keep going for Essence Warden. Then you could get an Essence Warden, then you could draw your whole deck for free, and then you could play another 2 Endurances and sack these. Then you can untap these with... So one thing you could do, right? Like, let's say I use these creatures to chord. I can then sack them, reset them, and use them for another chord later. That's one of the cool little tricks. But the big thing is, in this spot, right, we have to make a decision. Do we keep going or do we stop? You know, obviously that depends on the matchup. But in this particular situation, I'll just say, well, I have 7 cards in my hand. I have a replacement Yawgmoth. They kill my replacement Yawgmoth, and I can just be done, you know? There's no point in going too deep and putting yourself in a hole of your own device. You can just chill. You can sit here. You don't have to win the game right now. You will probably win the game next turn. You have to think, you know, what are the odds that I hit? You know, is it worth paying another 7 life to go to 1 or 2 or something like that, and then potentially whiff and put yourself in peril to just die to a simple lightning bolt? And that really depends on each match individually if it's worth the risk and how low you go. In this situation, with this like this, I would probably stop. I would probably stop thinking, next turn I have Yawgmoth, next turn I have Eldritch Evolution. Let's just stop. Okay, so I'm going to end my turn, and I'm going to go to the next turn. One thing is that whenever you have a situation like this, where you have a Yawgmoth and a Strangleroot, if you can, keep the +1/+1 counter on the Yawgmoth. And the reason that is because let's say we go to our next turn, and let's say our opponent's at 7 life, right? Our opponent's at 7 life. We don't need to combo kill them, right? We can just, let's say our opponent's at 7 life, right? So we can pay 1 life, choose one other creature, sack the Strangleroot, right? We drew the Blood Artist, so we could just kill them. But if they're at 7 life, we can just kill them. We can just attack for 7. Let's say they're at 9 life, right? We could just spend 2 mana, discard a card, proliferate these up, right? And now we're swinging for 9. And then, you know, let's say they're at 9 life, right? So now we could just kill them with regular damage. But that's not possible if you don't start your turn with a +1/+1 counter on the wolf. So anytime there's a situation where you might kill them with damage, you always want to make sure you end the turn with a +1/+1 counter on your wolf so you could proliferate it up to grow, and then you can kill people with combat damage. Because combat damage proliferate is one of the secret ways to just wreck people with this deck. It's one of the best things you could do in the deck. It's just like, oh, you're at 9. Rather than mess around with any sort of combo, just be like, okay, proliferate, attack you. That's how I win most of my games, is just proliferating, attacking. And this goes even more so when there's a grist involved, right? Like, you can proliferate the grist. You could proliferate the grist up. You can proliferate these things, and you can just end the game. But that's one way to win. So you always want to think about, do I need to combo here, or can I just kill them with damage? Since we drew the Blood Artist, we just need to play the Blood Artist, kill them, right? But you always want to leave the Yawgmoth with a +1/+1 counter, because you want that Yawgmoth to be able to be buffed up with the proliferate, because that just ends games. You just go proliferate, right? So always leave your Yawgmoth with a +1/+1 counter if you can help it, and leave this one with the no counter. And then next turn, when you start your turn, you're able to determine if you want to proliferate and go for damage, or if you want to bounce and go for combo. But I always think it's always best to try and think just regular old damage first. You want to prioritize killing people with regular damage. Now, that's hard to demonstrate in a game like this, just a random game with no opponent. But it's always something you want to think about. So the basic strategy that I use for this deck is pretty simple. Always develop your board every single turn. Try and add as much to the board as possible, thinking about the future every single turn, right? Always just develop the board. And another thing about this deck that I don't see a lot of other people who play this deck is you don't really want to sandbag lands. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes in a situation, you will have, like, let's say you have 2 lands and nothing else, right? Your hand is just 2 lands, and you're just like, well, maybe I should hold this card for information. But I don't think you should do that in this deck. I think you should always play your lands. And I think sandbagging your lands is bad because this deck is so greedy. It's so mana hungry that every turn you just have to think about, okay, what if I draw Yawgmoth this turn? What if this is the turn that I draw Yawgmoth? I want to be able to do the most possible things. I want to be able to do stuff. I want to be able to sack my creatures, right? I want to be able to do as many things as I can with my Yawgmoth if I draw it next turn. Obviously, this game, we kind of just had it all, right? But what I mean by that, I'll make another game here and we'll demonstrate what I'm talking about. Like, oftentimes, in a lot of decks, you can reach a point where you have a bunch of lands in play. And you have these lands in play and you're just like, well, I have 1,000,000 mana. I just drew 2 lands. I don't know what else to do, right? I'm just going to hold these lands so my opponent thinks I have something. I believe strongly in Yawgmoth that you don't want to do that. You want to progress your board as much as possible. So we'll play this here. We'll fetch. We'll play this like we're playing a regular game, right? So here I would want to go. I would always want to develop. Let's pretend we don't have these 2 Yawgmoths in our hand, right? So these aren't here. So let's develop our board. Let's play the Blood Artist, right? Let's play the Hierarch. Now we're gonna go to turn 3, right? Now we're pretending we don't have the Yawgmoth, right? But like, let's say we're in this position right here where we just play this land tapped, get in for some damage, right? And now, so now we're like flooding out big time. The point of this is just play your lands. Yes, you can sandbag them, right? But you want to think of how big and explosive your next turn will be if you play a Yawgmoth, right? Let's say so always keep that in mind. It's super important. I watch a lot of people do this, right? And it costs them games, right? You always want to like plus your board. And now, for example, this next turn, right? Next turn, if these Yawgmoths aren't in our hand, I would play out this Misty Rainforest, right? I would play it out because you want to put yourself in a position to have the most broken Yawgmoth turns as possible every single turn, right? Like, let's say next turn, right? Let's say we draw a Court of Calling next turn, right? Then we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we only have 3 mana plus a land drop to play with. We're not counting the Grist, right? You always want to have as much mana for your broken Yawgmoth turns as possible. Traditional logic and traditional Magic logic would say, sandbag a land, right? Let the opponent think you have something. But I think I really believe this. And you could take this with a grain of salt. And obviously there are exceptions. But I think you want to play and you want to develop your mana base every single turn to put yourself in a position to have the most broken Yawgmoth turns as possible, right? And what I mean is, like, next turn, if we, like, let's pretend we ignore these 2 Yawgmoths, and then next turn we draw Chord, we have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to cast the Yawgmoth to get the Chord, and then we only have 3 mana plus 1 more, so 4 mana to add to the board, So you always want to think like that. Think like, all right, so how much am I going to add? So let's start off. So, you know, we'd want to plus our grist. We'd actually mill the cord. That's funny. So in situations like this, so now we'll start. All right, so next turn, this is our Yawgmoth. So we drew the Yawgmoth, right? So now we drew the Yawgmoth. We want to use our creatures first. So this is what I mean, right? Like, we drew the Yawgmoth this turn. We're ignoring these two Yawgmoths, right? So we drew this Yawgmoth. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 mana. Which is going to make it very easy for us to kill our opponent. And if we sandbag this land, if we didn't play it, we'd only have 4 mana plus 1 land drop. This way, we have a lot more mana to kill our opponents. So let's see if we could find a way to kill our opponents from here. The first thing I would do in this situation is I would attack with an insect token, right? Get in some damage, right? So we get in some damage. We get the double exalted trigger. We attack, get the triggers, trigger. We kill them. So now we take this insect that did such great work and then we kill it. Pay 1. Choose up to 1 target creature. Choose nothing. Sack it. Ping them 1. Save targets. Always yield. Draw a card. So another grist doesn't really do anything. Now this is a situation again where before we use this grist, we want to make sure we know what we're doing with it. Because since it's at 5 loyalty, we can also use it to, we could sack 1, 2, 3 creatures. We could even sack 4 creatures, and grist counts itself, so we're capable of doing, as it stands right now, we can go sack, 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 use this ultimate, and we could do a big chunk of damage here. So in this situation, before you use the grist, take your time. Take a minute. Figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your turn. So now, let's sack this other insect token. Pay 1 life, choose 1 target, okay. Sack the insect token, draw a card. Another land, that doesn't really help us. So now we can start sacking these dorks, because this is probably going to be the last turn of the game. We still have a bunch of mana to use. Pay 1 life, choose 1 dark creature, sack the birds of paradise. We drew another grist. That's not great. We don't need those. Now we sack an ignoble hierarch. We drew another land. Now remember, this land can act as another creature because of the Dryad Arbor. Because we have the Dryad Arbor in the deck. So we don't really just want to slam one of these lands down. We want to think what land is best. This can also get the Dryad Arbor, right? We want to take our time and we want to think. This land, you always want to think what lands are left in the deck. Right now, my build has 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a basic swamp and a Dryad Arbor left. So if I want to get the Dryad Arbor, I have to use this Misty to get the Dryad Arbor and then use this land to get the swamp. But we still want to keep going. Pay 1 life, choose 1 target, okay, sack this. So now we drew an Eldritch Evolution. So that's pretty good. We can plus the grist, use the grist, get a Droff's Messenger, and start pinging them. But here, it depends on what life our opponent's at. So for example, if our opponent's at 15 life, let's say, we can use the Eldritch Evolution, sack the Blood Artist, or we can crack this, get a Dryad Arbor, sack the Dryad Arbor to get Strangleroot Geist, because it goes from 0 to 2. So let's do that. Let's sack this. Let's get the Dryad Arbor. Let's go 1, 2, 3. Eldritch Evolution, sack the Dryad Arbor. Okay. Get a Strangleroot Geist. Now we pay 1 life, choose 1 dark creature. Okay. Sack the Strangleroot Geist. Draw a card. And so now we've done a lot of damage to our opponent. And now we can think about Gristalt. right? Because right now we have 4 creatures in the graveyard. Now, this will count itself. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we could sack these 2, sack this. So I always want to think about alternate ways to killing, as opposed to always going for the combo. Like we've sacked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 creatures plus this. So we have put them to, let's say they're at 10 life, for example. Let's say from all our Blood Artist triggers, it doesn't work when there's no opponent. But for the sake of everything, we'll say they're at 10 life. We've already attacked. So now we can sack, choose up to nothing, sack our Stranglerootgeist. They go to 9. Play this. Sack that. They go to 7. Right, now we can sack this. They go to 6. Pay 1 life, choose a 1 dark creature. Okay, sack this. They go to 6. Then we activate Grist. And there's 7 creatures and it counts itself, so that's 8. So they're dead. Right? They're dead, and we didn't even use the combo, so to speak. Right? So you always want to think in terms of developing your board every single turn, and I personally don't believe in sandbagging lands. That was kind of an awkward example, but because I don't have an actual opponent, so it's hard to see what I'm talking about in terms of alternate ways to win. But I think this is a good example of what I'm talking about, right? Where you have the Grist alt plus attacking, right? Plus pinging with the Blood Artist, where you're finding a way to, while you're trying to find the combo, you're just killing them with chip damage. And we literally used every single land that we had. So that's why I believe you want to progress your board every single turn. Every single turn, play a land. Even if it means you kind of telegraph to your opponent that you don't have anything, just think of the next turn with Yawgmoth and how much more powerful that will be with 1 extra mana. You always want to think in terms of how explosive, how powerful can my Yawgmoth turn be? What are the things that I can do to progress my board this turn? And always just look, always, you know, when you're messing around with your creatures, always think, have I made a land drop this turn? Yes. Okay, then I don't need to start bouncing and drawing cards. Just think, I want to progress my turn as much as possible. I want to progress my board as much as possible every single turn. That's the key. That's one of the keys to this deck. And don't sandbag your lands. Just play your lands, even if it reveals information, because you want to have those really explosive Yawgmoth turns where you want to be able to use as much mana as possible and to impact the board as much as possible and to potentially kill your opponent. Whether it's through Grist Proliferate, proliferating Yawgmoth, proliferating Stranglerootgeist. There's a lot of ways to win, and it's not necessarily always with the combo. In fact, I reckon that I probably kill people more with Grist alts and chip damage than I do with actual Blood Artist, Straw's Messenger combos. That's the strength of the deck, is the fact that it can do both. It can combo and it can just beat down, kill people, find ways to win. And thank you for watching Yawgmoth 102. I hope this helps. A little bit more advanced strategy of how I play the deck. More videos will be coming soon. I kind of understand this YouTube thing a little bit more, so more videos will be coming soon. And thank you all for watching this video. Hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.